Today, we're diving into a fascinating story, what I'm calling the engineer's enigma. It's about a man who, for a living, could build these incredibly complex, incredibly reliable systems, but could never quite manage to build one for himself. We're going to explore his journey to finally figure out why. This right here, this single sentence from a man named Russell, really gets to the heart of it all. It's this feeling, of constantly patching things up only to watch them collapse again. And that feeling is what pushed him, at 50 years old, to finally get an answer he'd been looking for his entire life. So to really understand that feeling of collapse, we need to go back to the beginning of his journey. We need to meet the man behind this mystery. So this is Russell. On paper, he is the definition of success. He's a system reliability engineer, which means he manages these highly complex computer systems. At work, he's seen as capable, knowledgeable, the guy you go to. But underneath all of that, there was this constant nagging feeling that something just didn't add up. And this wasn't some sudden midlife crisis. Oh no. Russell had been trying to figure this out for decades. He'd been assessed for depression, for anxiety, even for bipolar disorder, but none of those labels ever really seemed to fit. He was always battling this intense imposter syndrome. In fact, it took him 15 years after taking a simple online autism screener to finally build up the courage to ask for a formal referral. 15 years. And it was in that formal assessment. That's where the mask of success, the one he had worn for 50 years, really started to crack. It's where the hidden, difficult realities of his life started to come out. Just look at this contrast. It's staggering. On the left, you had the successful engineer, the guy who keeps complex systems running. And on the right, the reality he was actually living. During his assessments, he shared that he'd once lost a job over personal hygiene, that he was often behind on his mortgage payments. It even got to a point where social services had to get involved with his son's care. It's just this profound disconnect between his professional self and his private life. And you have to understand, these weren't just a few isolated bad moments. The assessment revealed this lifelong pattern of struggle. It was affecting his money, his family, his housing, even just basic life stuff, like keeping his driver's license up to date. And here, Russell puts a name to the system he'd built just to survive: masking. For 50 years, he had basically engineered a performance of being normal to hide just how much he was struggling. And honestly, a huge part of why he finally sought help was the sheer exhaustion of keeping that mask on for 5 decades. His routines were this kind of double-edged sword for him. On the one hand, they were his comfort zone. Things like waiting by the door until the exact right minute to leave, or making sure the TV volume was always a multiple of 2.5. He said those things just felt right. But they were also incredibly fragile. If that routine got broken for just a couple of days, everything, in his words, would just fall apart. And his interests, they followed this same kind of pattern. His intense, lifelong focus on technology, that built his entire career. But at the same time, he described his room as being full of abandoned hobbies, things like ukuleles, juggling balls, stuff he'd get intensely obsessed with, dive into head first, and then just drop. So Russell's story, it really shines a light on this huge challenge in adult diagnosis. How do you possibly untangle a whole lifetime of symptoms? And this brings us to a really critical issue that clinicians face, something called the overlap problem. See, to make a diagnosis, clinicians often rely on tools like the ADOS-2. It's pretty much considered the gold standard. It's a structured assessment where they observe someone's behavior to look for traits associated with autism. Okay, so you've got a gold standard test. That should give you a nice, clean answer, right? Well, it turns out it is not that simple. Not at all. Especially when other conditions might be in the mix. Take a look at this number. 52.5%. What do you think that could possibly represent? Yeah, according to one study, that's the rate of false positives when using a certain ADOS-2 scoring method on a group of patients with schizophrenia. Let that sink in. Over half of them scored high enough to meet the criteria for autism. This is the overlap problem in a nutshell. Some traits, especially around social stuff, can look really similar in different conditions, and they can end up confusing even our best diagnostic tools. So if the total score on the test isn't reliable enough, how can clinicians possibly tell the difference? Well, the same study that pointed out this big problem also proposed a solution.
basically using a sharper lens.
What they found was that the key isn't looking at the total number of traits someone has. No, the real answer is in a very specific pattern of traits. It's all about knowing which clues to pay attention to. The researchers came up with this predictive model that focuses on just 6 key items. Think of it like this. Certain things, like unusual eye contact, are pretty classic indicators for autism. But other things they look for in the assessment, like a really disorganized way of telling a story about something that happened, were actually much more predictive of schizophrenia in this group. So it's not about one single clue, it's about how the whole combination of clues fits together to create a clearer picture.
And the results are, well, they're pretty striking. This graph shows the accuracy of these different approaches. See those red and blue lines kind of hovering in the middle? That's the standard way of scoring. It's barely better than flipping a coin. But that teal line way up at the top, that's the new 6-item model. It basically moves from a guess to a near certainty. It's a much, much clearer signal through all the noise. So, let's bring all this back to Russell. Because for him, and for so many other people, this whole process isn't just some academic exercise. It's about finding a framework for the future. Ultimately, Russell's goal here really gets to the heart of why any of this matters. He wasn't just chasing a label. He was searching for an explanation that would finally unlock coping strategies that would actually work. After a whole lifetime of things falling apart, he needed a system that would finally stick.
And that's the real power of an accurate diagnosis, especially for an adult. It's not just the word. It's the coherent story it gives you. It's a framework that takes a lifetime of confusing, frustrating, and painful experiences and reframes them into something that finally makes sense. And that's the first step towards self-acceptance and getting support that actually helps. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Russell's story is such a powerful reminder that what we see on the outside, outward success, can so often be a mask for some really profound internal struggles. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What invisible battles are being fought just beneath the surface in the people we see and interact with every single day?